I think. I think we'll start. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, everyone, I think we'll start. If that's okay, we'll have a break, an hour and 10 minutes. This lecture is in 4 parts. The first part is a kind of overview and a look at Foucault. The second part is a look at post-colonial sexuality and politics. The third part is, I think, Tamale, and the fourth part is Rubin, or maybe the other way around. But please stop me at any point if you have any questions or interventions. And we'll talk a bit about the readings when you are more awake. Okay, it's not working. Amazing. Okay, so this kind of overview part of the lecture is partly drawn from a book by Correa, Pichetsky and Parker, and you'll recognise Sonia Correa and Richard Parker's names from the GII reading. The book's called Sexuality, Health and Human Rights, and I really like it because it looks at sexuality in its broadest sense, and it looks at it as a political kind of global public policy issue. And I am going to use it to situate the politics of sexuality. So they argue, and it's also very much in the kind of post-colonial Foucauldian framing, which this lecture is as well. If that doesn't make sense, please jump up and down. Okay, so they argue that sex is not an empirical reality, but a complex construct of multiple discursive framing and political struggles. And they say that it's a field really strongly shaped by social movements, by the feminist movement, by the women's health movement, where there's been a focus on sexual well-being and sexual freedom, by the LGBTQI movement, where there's been an emphasis on sexual diversity, and by AIDS activism, which really emphasized the importance of sexuality to other aspects of social political life. And the famous slogan for HIV activists in the 90s was "Silence is equal to death." So it was really about kind of bringing these issues into visibility and into the public space. And I don't know if you remember the Henry Amos quote from the GAI lecture, but it was about exclusion as a sexually non-normative person being a form of poverty. So it was linking the ideas of normativity to sexuality. And Correa, Pruchetsky, and Parker say that from these social movements have emerged three central articulations or insights. These are, the first, that sexual rights are human rights. And remember in the GII lecture as well, I talked about the shift from sexuality being seen as a health issue, to sexuality being seen as a rights issue. Okay, and we're very much in the space now where sexuality is seen as a rights issue. So sexuality cannot be understood in isolation. This is their second insight that's come from these social movements. It cannot be seen in isolation from the social, political, and economic structures within which it is embedded, or without reference to the cultural and ideological discourses that give its meaning. So it's contextual, and it's constructed through discourse. And you'll recognize Foucault in this very strongly, right? Sexual health and rights are systematically shaped by multiple forms of structural violence, social inequalities, poverty and economic exploitation, racism and ethnically based exclusion, gender and sexual oppression, discrimination and stigma, age differentials, disability, and other manifestations of disempowerment in ways that have typically meant that their greatest negative impact has been felt by groups and populations that are already marginalized and or oppressed within society, often in manifold ways. And think back to the Robert Hamlin video piece in which he explores those intersections with sexuality at the center of it. And think to kind of all the stuff you've been learning about social hierarchies and exclusions, and sexuality as one of the pieces of that architecture. So the third kind of takeaway that Correa, Parker, and Pruchetsky have from the sexual rights movement is the need to approach research and intervention in relation to sexuality as an extension of broader struggles for human rights and social justice. And this is a recurring theme in the human rights. So if you work with child rights, for example, the kind of adultism and the social exclusion experienced by children, the social and political exclusion, is also seen as kind of one of these intersections in the structure of social hierarchy that we need to unpick if we are going to kind of live in a world that is more socially just. And you'll also recognize Kate Bedford's work that we talked about, the World Bank report that she did in Latin America that looked at sexuality as just one of many parts of kind of social hierarchies. Okay, so they talk about socially engaged agency, which I really like, this idea of empowerment not as individualized, but as kind of connected to other people, which is articulated in lots of different ways. In Latin America, it's often called protagonismo. In Southern Africa, it's linked to the concept of Ubuntu. They say whether the focus is HIV and AIDS, abortion, sexual abuse and violence, genital mutilation, the discrimination and the exclusion imposed on sexual minorities or any other major issue related to sexuality, work being developed in local communities everywhere has emphasized the profound importance of empowerment, or what might be described as socially engaged agency. And that list is really important in terms of broadening your understanding of the politics of sexuality and the things that it contains. So I'm going to say this again, that sexuality is not just about LGBTQI rights. It's about our relationship with our body and how that body interacts in space with other bodies and with social norms. So empowerment and socially engaged agency is a precondition for for reducing risk and vulnerability and promoting erotic justice and freedom. And here you'll also recognize the resonances with the pleasure stuff that we talked about at the end of the GII lecture, right? So this idea that where we have sexuality, we have both pleasure and danger at once because it's expressed through the body. And that has been a key fault line in feminist thought, starting with Carol Vance's 1970-something, I should know from the Rubin reading, but the conference that was held at Barnard, where the feminists kind of split straight through the middle, those that were kind of pro-pornography and those that were anti, or in fact, that's an entirely simplistic kind of characterization of it. And a lot of Rubin's work, and I actually read this weekend, Rubin's got 3 articles that have been written, or 3 chapters around the one that you guys had to read. There's a forward now and an afterwards and another kind of reflections piece. And all of them are grappling with the extent to which the debate has been made very simplistic and very binary. And all of them are kind of pleas from her for more nuance and more diversity and more kind of kindness, I guess. And her writing is quite resonant of a lot of the debates at the moment in the space around TERFs, trans-sex-leading radical feminists, and trans politics. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later in the lecture. Has heterosexuality always existed? So hopefully you can answer this if you were in my other lecture. Anyone? According to Foucault, homosexuality and heterosexuality were kind of invented in the 1870s. And they were invented and kind of became these binary concepts. So the idea is that and Jeffrey Weeks has written a lot about this in the UK context, but the idea is that with industrialization, with increasing urbanization in Euro-America, there was the development of heterosexuality and homosexuality as kind of forms of identity rather than as practices. And here we have Foucault and Weeks writing about this. Foucault has been hugely influential, not just in the field of sexuality, but also in the field of power. There are a lot of people in this building who write a lot about power and social movements and social change, including Rosie McGee, John Gaventa, Alex Shankland, and a lot of people in that team, Miyoko. And they often use Luke's and Gaventa. It's quite important to understand the Foucauldian. Does anyone want to characterize Foucault's ideas on power? Anyone who's presenting this week? Natia?
I was just laughing because we were about to form a group to read Foucault. Yeah, but I would say he says that power, it also connects power with discourse, right? And
Yeah.
He says that power is diffuse, so power is not something that we have, but something that we exercise in relations.
Yeah, yeah. And how does Tamale talk about power?
She talks about a woman's power who against the moral panic. When there is moral panic exists, the women use their power and to rescript the legal and political discourse.
Exactly. So that idea of kind of positive and negative power, and the idea of power being everywhere and not cited in particular bodies, is really important for feminists, because what it means is that you can create counter discourse or counter hegemonic narratives, and it means you can reclaim power, right? And there have been huge debates. I think Lois McNay is probably the most famous writer in terms of looking at Foucault from a feminist lens and exploring to what extent agency exists for women in his writing. A lot of people kind of said we can't use him. He's kind of slightly misogynist and he's a gay man. He knows nothing about women and there's no space for agency in his writing at all. And then other people have said actually that's not true. And the fact that power doesn't sit in a particular site and that where there's power, there's always counter power. And that's really important. If you take away one thing from Foucault, just the idea that power is multi-sided and does not sit in one place is really important because of what it affords for our agency. Okay, so, but he looked at sexuality, and he talks about power in relation to that. These quotes are from Warenga and Savori, who write on kind of southern sexualities. And they say sexuality has emerged as a field of knowledge from the end of the 19th century onwards in Europe as a response to the Industrial Revolution in the wake of eugenics and the belief that the destiny of nation could be controlled by the means of manipulating the semantic makeup of its population. So this is really important, the idea of sexuality and gender as well, and we've talked about this before, being kind of invented with empire and being invented at a certain point where science was all about controlling bodies and kind of saying which bodies were good, which bodies were bad, which bodies were allowed to kind of own stuff, which bodies weren't, which bodies were going to be kept in slavery, all those kinds of things. So you can't separate all these forms of power and hierarchy from each other. And sexuality is one of those. So sexuality is a separate domain of human experience as an object of regulation is a recent Western intervention produced by the discourse of modernity around identity, subjectivities, bodies, and population control. And we'll talk about this in the next section around post-coloniality and those politics and what that means, and the fact that sexuality was very much used as a form of control and what that means for contemporary politics in the South. So it's impossible to think with any clarity about the politics of race or gender as long as these are thought of as biological entities rather than social constructs. So we talked about this very early on in terms of essentialism and constructionist thoughts around gender. And now we're looking at it in terms of sexuality. And Rubin has been, and we'll again look at this in the section on Rubin, but Rubin has been very influential in kind of disarticulating gender from sexuality and in emphasizing the importance of that for analyzing things socially. As defined by ancient civil or canonical codes, sodomy was a category of forbidden acts. Their perpetrator was nothing more than the juridical subject of them. The 19th century homosexual became a personage, a past, a case history, and a childhood, in addition to being a type of life, a life form, and a morphology with an indiscrete anatomy and possibly a mysterious physiology. The sodomite had been a temporary aberration. The homosexual was now a species. So this is Foucault, and this is a really important passage in the history of sexuality, which is why I've lifted it out. This is Foucault, cited in Rubin, describing the emergence of the homosexual as a person, right, rather than just as a sex act. So again, we touched on this in the GII lecture, and Petetsky, Carrere, and Parker talk about it a lot in their work, this idea that sexuality was primarily a moral and a religious concern, and many might argue that is still the case in many contexts. But then it became more of a medical or political one with industrialization or urbanization. So sexology was a branch of science or medicine that emerged in the late 19th century. And we've looked at some of these people already: Richard von Krafft-Ebing, Magnus Hirschfeld, Henry Havelock. These are all early sexologists who were, fascinated by the way that humans expressed their sexuality. And there was this move from sexual behavior to sexual identities with the invention of heterosexuality and homosexuality around 1870. And with that came this idea, and Rubin talks about this a lot, that there are good or bad forms of sex, but also now there are bad and sick people. So what happens when you move sex from an act to kind of a type of person is that those people then become really stigmatized rather than the act. And that's really important, obviously. So this opens the door to the pathologizing and criminalizing of people on the basis of this identity, but also opened the door for fighting for these rights as minority identities. Any questions? No? Okay, so in the 1950s, gay rights movements emerged because homosexuals were now a thing. And so they became this new social minority and occupied this kind of ethnic identity. In the 90s, there was kind of an affirmation of this in some ways. In the 90s, there was lesbian feminism, which we talked about in earlier lectures. This idea of compulsory heterosexuality and lesbian existence, and the lesbian as a category outside of women. You'll recognize that from the radical feminists and minority feminist lecture. And in the 80s, there was an emergence of queer theory and politics that was really a move away from this minority experience and looking more at this kind of how different sexualities were constructed discursively in different contexts. Really important writers in this are Butler, who you've heard about quite a lot already, Diane Fuss, and also Sedgwick, who wrote about the epistemology of the closet and the idea of coming out. And Sedgwick is hugely influential on Rubin's work, and a lot of people actually. So what queer politics does is it challenges the notion of sexual identity as stable or binary. So here we have a similar kind of scenario to the theorizing around gender, in that we have this idea of kind of women emerging as an essential thing, then that being deconstructed, and then kind of the stability of that also being challenged, right? So we had the separation of sex and gender, and then we had Butler coming in and saying actually neither of these are stable, and they're not that separable necessarily, and you can't necessarily separate them from biology or from kind of social structures. So queer theorists come in and they say, well, everything is up for change, and we're constantly kind of reinventing ourselves against the social norms that we find ourselves in. And that norm itself is revealed as a construction. So here we've got Butler again, and Butler obviously is hugely influenced also by Foucault's ideas about discourse and power. So there's this notion also that the normative is not stable and can be challenged. That's really important. Just a bit of kind of biographical background on Foucault. So he was a philosopher, and he looked at knowledge and power, and he examined the ways in which knowledge was created and circulated in communities and societies through discourse, and how those in power control and regulate this discourse. He was mostly writing in the 60s and 70s against the backdrop of massive social change, as young activists rebelled against the politics and social mores of the older generation, both in the States and in France and in other places. One of the major movements in this period was the sexual revolution, which rebelled against what was seen as a sexual repression of previous generations. Foucault was gay. He was also really into S&M. His parents were quite kind of conservative middle-class doctors. He found that really challenging. He died of AIDS. He tried to commit suicide on several occasions as a young man. And a lot of his work is really about him kind of grappling with himself and working against society's insistence that his non-normativity should condemn him to exclusion. So it comes from a very kind of deep place where he is excluded and is grappling with that and theorizing that. He's been hugely influential. And these are kind of some of the ways. So he really came to understand sexuality as a cultural system. And he had this tripartite analysis, which had sexuality, knowledge, and power that were all constructed through discourse. And his 3-volume study, which is all about sexuality, tries to kind of reconsider. And I don't know how much of you know about his kind of working method, but he constructs a kind of anthropological approach to history that looks backwards and tries to work out how things emerged when they emerged. Really, really interesting and quite readable as well. So in volume 1 of the history of sexuality, he looks at the repressive hypothesis, and he said that the bourgeoisie was really concerned with economic productivity, and they didn't want energy wasted on sexual pursuits. So sex outside of procreative purposes was repressed. And he said the understanding of sexuality is a natural libido learning to break free of the repressive social constraints of the 17th century to the 20th century. So he has this whole idea about sexual repression and why it was useful socially during this time. And he also argues that although we think of Victorians as kind of repressing sexuality, in fact, they were obsessed with it. And he's got a lot of arguments that kind of explain why that was the case, which is quite interesting. And if you think about Freud's work, he has kind of similar things to say about the kind of central importance of sexuality to our lives. But Foucault very centrally argues that desires are not pre-existing, that they are constituted in the course of historically specific social practices. And he emphasizes the generative aspect of the social organization of sex rather than its repressive elements by pointing out that new sexualities are constantly being produced. So he widens our notion of sex. This thing about kind of generative social organization is also really important because it resonates with Butler's idea that if you do something again and again, it becomes productive. This idea of kind of productive power rather than repressive power is also central to his theorizing, and we'll talk more about that in later lectures. And he points to a major discontinuity between kinship-based systems of sexuality and more modern forms. And this is Jeffrey Weeks kind of talking about his central takeaway from Foucault. What I believe was, above all, what we got from Foucault was a denaturalization of the history of sexuality, a challenge to linearity, to easy progressivism, to wanting sexuality to be a force against power, and instead a recognition of the significance of the social, a heterogeneous assemblage of practices where sexuality as a human institution had become increasingly the heart. So essentially what Weeks is saying here is that sexuality is very much at the center of everything, right? And obviously that's a particular lens. So there are four sources of knowledge or power that contributed to the construction of sexuality, according to Foucault. The hysterization of women's bodies, which led us to view women as being highly sexual and as a source of medical knowledge around human reproduction. The pedagogization of children's sex, which sees children as highly sexual and as something dangerous that needs to be monitored or controlled. The socialization of procreative behavior, which maintains reproduction as an important matter for society and positions non-procreative sex as negative and non-productive. And the psychiatrization of perverse pleasure. So these, according to Foucault, are some of the ways in which contemporary sexuality is constructed. And you'll recognize that Rubin's reading draws quite heavily on this. And that doesn't work. Okay, so biopower, which, have we talked about biopower already? A little bit, maybe. Okay, so biopower is Foucault's big thing. It's like his understanding of power, and he talks of it as against sovereign power, and he defines power in different ways. Sovereign power is like super hierarchical power, where the kind of the ultimate thing is that the sovereign will kind of say, off with your head, and has the power to take away your life. Whereas biopower is how we regulate contemporary society through social norms. So that's the idea of power being everywhere and power being dispersed. So it's not about one group imposing their will or one person imposing their will on another. Foucault came to understand it differently. He talks about biopower as diffuse and everywhere, and he draws on Bentham's panopticon, which is a design for a prism. I'm sure I've talked to you about this earlier in the year, maybe not. Anyway, the idea is that this prison is circular and that in the middle there's like a guard's tower, and the guards can see everyone in the prison, but the prisoners can't see into the tower. And so eventually that architecture becomes self-regulating because the guards don't actually need to be in the tower for the prisoners to feel like they're being watched. And that's kind of Foucault's explanation of how normative power works, that we always feel like we're being observed and that we have to behave in a particular way, even if we don't necessarily, right? Because the prisoners always feel observed. There's no way of telling whether or not that they're being watched. So this also speaks to the pain and vulnerability of non-normativity, and it's really worth bearing that in mind when you think about Foucault's work. So development, according to Sonia Correa and Susie Jolly, development has assumed an essentialist view of sexuality as a natural drive and a unified domain of human experience, with heterosexuality and gender difference as biological imprints. The very absence of explicit discussion of sexuality in development discourse about, say, population or the household implies that sexuality is classed as a natural individual preference which does not need to be taken into account. And again, that's something that we talked about a lot in the GII lecture. And the way into development from sexuality scholars was initially by talking about poverty, because that was something that couldn't be contested as a kind of mainstream development issue. So they hitched onto that in early discussions about sexuality. I would say now, I think, and particularly with the kind of social movements of the 90s and the noughties, sexuality is quite kind of center stage as a right, but maybe not in terms of its kind of broad politics, more just in terms of LGBTQI social movements and that kind of diversity being accepted as an important development issue. So the critiques of the essentialist understandings of sexuality, which hopefully you'll be familiar with already, is that there's no room for change, there's a limitation of diversity, there's an obstruction of new and diverse rights claims, it obscures how power operates through sex, and it doesn't describe the reality of people's sexualities. There was quite a lot of talk about sexuality in the wake of the Oxfam scandal, and I think that to some extent did broaden the discussions of power and sexuality in the development field, not very helpfully necessarily. So the transformation of essentialist approaches in the past few decades have been kind of really significant, and Foucault has shifted our understanding and others of sexuality as something that should be regulated by society to something that is produced by society. That's a really important distinction, right? And I'd say that that isn't necessarily always the case, as I'm sure you'll recognize, and as is evident even in the Tamale reading. Any questions about that or concerns? You guys are so quiet today. Okay, how are we doing for time? Okay, good. So we'll do this part 2 and then we'll look at the readings in the second part and maybe try and do it a little bit more discursively, because hopefully you can all contribute to that as well. Okay, so I talked about the way in which sexuality and gender and race and empire were all very much caught up in each other and kind of constructed together. Anne McClintock's Imperial Leather is a really important contribution to this field. She writes about the way in which race, gender, and sexuality were all co-constructed in service of empire. Her case study is kind of broadly sub-Saharan African, and it's a brilliant book. I really encourage you to read it. Mary Ann Stoller has written a similar book in the kind of Dutch Asian context, which again is really fantastic. McClintock talks about the cult of domesticity as crucial or central to imperialism, and imperialism as a violent encounter with other pre-existing hierarchies of power. And she talks about the construction of whiteness, family, and particular forms of gender, race, and sexuality. Very much also in the kind of Foucauldian form, I guess. And then in terms of Southern sexualities, there have been a lot of writers who have tried to historically mine pre-colonial history to prove, if you like, that queerness or homosexuality or non-normative heteronormative sexualities existed prior to colonial invasion. And that's been kind of one of the responses to the politics of sexuality. So this idea that you mine the pre-colonial past against arguments that it's a Western import. These are Tommy Boy's Lesbian Men, Ancestral Wives is a book by Ruth Morgan and Saskia Warenga that's been really important. Then another kind of key political strand, I guess, in sexuality discourse has been about resisting neo-colonial framings. And you came across that in the Kaminga reading, the way that sexuality is really politically contested and the way it plays out differently, often as an anti-colonial thing. Mas'ad is an Egyptian writer who has written about the way in which Western gays kind of have recolonized parts of the world, and they've gone out looking for homosexuals and found them and funded them. And so he has this whole kind of discourse about the gay internationale as this kind of colonial army. And then a lot of contemporary sexuality literature does really close studies of specific communities in order to be kind of contextually specific, which is also a reaction to the kind of splintering of postmodern theory that says you have to have very, very located kind of small studies to make any sense and to have interventions that kind of articulate properly. So Tamale is very careful about adopting a broad framing of sexuality in the Ugandan context. And this, again, is a very kind of important insight, I guess. If you read across the sexuality literature, a lot of people have tried to keep as broad a frame as possible. So issues of sexuality are not subsumed by gay politics, particularly in contexts where you wouldn't get anywhere with a sexual agenda if that were the case. So people who want to kind of help women with their health or whatever are very careful not to talk about that as sexuality because they won't necessarily be able to operate in those circumstances. And so if you look at the kind of wording of particular books, it's really, really interesting. So Tamale talks about sexuality. Neville Hode, who writes about Uganda, talks about intimacies. Mark Ekprecht, who writes about sub-Saharan Africa as well, talks about dissident sexuality. Akshay Khanna, who's an Indian scholar who was based here for a while, talks about sexualness. So there are also people trying to reclaim a different kind of discourse that is more southern situated and talks kind of in parallel, I guess, to what's seen as Western academic hegemony and trying to step outside of that. So that is a kind of politics of refusal. And there's some really great queer literature that talks about refusal as a political strategy. And you can really recognize that in the language that a lot of Southern theorists use in this field. So it's a kind of, we don't want to get involved in these kind of complex colonial, neo-colonial moves. We want to talk about something that's separate from that, so we'll invent our own language to talk about it. Zetu Matebeni, who's a South African scholar, has written Queer Africa, which is a kind of indigenous reclaiming of queerness as African. And she uses Africa with a K to kind of indicate pushing against a Western canon as well. And it's a kind of reclaiming of queerness as African. Others like Sukari Ekin, who's a Nigerian scholar, and Hakima Abbas also have kind of tried to locate queerness from an indigenous perspective. So there's a lot of very interesting kind of, politics in this area, a lot of which writes against that kind of central Western canon, both as a means of refusing it or embracing it, depending on obviously who's writing. Some historical moments that I think are really interesting to this kind of post-colonial framing of sexuality and how it interacts with power. This is driving me mad. So we talked about the Kabacha of Buganda in the GIR lecture, and I read you that little abstract which kind of contextualized the politics of that. In 1886, the last indigenous ruler of the Buganda executed 30 pages for refusing to have sex with him following their conversion to Christianity. So African sodomy at this time was seen as anti-colonial resistance, which is kind of interesting. In 1995, Mugabe expelled GALS, which is the Gay Lesbian Society of Zimbabwe, from the ZIBF, the Zimbabwe International Book Fair, calling homosexuals sodomists and perverts worse than pigs and dogs, very famously. Hode suggests that this was about an assertion of an authentic African leadership against South Africa. South Africa at the time was emerging as a kind of darling of the West and as a new power, and also as with its new constitution was kind of super progressive. And so Hode argues that Mugabe and Museveni and others in that region, as a way of kind of asserting an African indigeneity that was against the West, kind of partly asserted homophobia as part of that. So this idea that our views on sexuality are very, very caught up in regional and global politics and can't be seen outside of that. More recently, traditional leaders in South Africa have tried to change the constitution because they see it as too progressive. And they're kind of aligned with this idea of the gay internationality, that South Africa has been colonized by the West and therefore is much more kind of open to different sexualities than it should be necessarily. So homosexuality has become a marker of national or civilizational specificity, and it's hugely contested space in racial politics. There's a book called The Pink Line by Mark Kafissa, which is really great, and he's a Joburg-based journalist, and he looks at the way in which sexual politics have been mobilized by different people. I really like Neville Hode's work as well. I think it's quite brilliant. And he, again, looks at the global politics of particular kind of understandings of sexuality. And, of course, there's been a lot of debate around Section 377, which was overturned by the Supreme Court in Delhi in 2018. And this idea that, in fact, homophobia rather than homosexuality is a Western import. There's like a lot of kind of arguments about that as well, both in the South Asian context and in the Southern African context. And I'm going backwards, which is always good. Okay. So how does the politics of sexuality intersect with other transnational, local, and national politics around particular issues? How is it mobilized by specific interest groups? We have La Marea Verde, the Green Wave in Latin America, around decriminalizing abortions. La Manif pour Tout, France. So these are all kind of significant movements in the gender backlash, which, as you know, many of us in the building are kind of studying at the moment. Deepta and I are going to do a session on backlash next term, I think, in the politics of gender, which will come immediately after the session on feminist social movements. That's what Heather and I do. And all of the kind of issues around the controlling of women's bodies are very much a kind of contemporary fault line, you know, like whether women should be allowed to have abortions, whether women should be allowed to be naked in public. All of these things are very kind of contemporary and are very important at the moment. La Manif pour Tout is a kind of pro-family organization in France. And I think I'll probably leave most of this until the POG lecture on this. But there've been, a lot of social movements that involve sexuality. I'm sure you can think of some in your own context, both in terms of progressive and right-wing, increasingly. There's a great article on the control of women's bodies, which I think we also look at in body politics next term in POG, in the Egyptian Revolution. I can't remember who wrote it now, but it's very much a kind of Foucauldian analysis of that as well. I think. Oh, okay. So we've talked about this as well, and I talked about it specifically in relation to the UN's Progress of the World's Women's Report, which the most recent version of was framed as being about family, to try and broaden the definition of the family and try and escape the kind of heteronormative straitjacketing of the right. And Laura, who runs that report, used to be based here and was kind of doing a lot of politicking around it to make it about the family, but from a very kind of progressive lens. So the family is one of the key sites of struggle around sexuality. And and this idea that you produce sexuality in a particular way. So this is a quote from Moringa and Savory. The heterosexual family is a key site, a central site for the production of sexuality, of its pleasures, but also for the policing of counter-normative desires deemed to be dangerous to the stability of the patriarchal order. So there's a lot of writing at the moment about the kind of swing to the right and the idea of normative sexualities being policed in the context of the family, and the kind of existential nervousness around the current moment of very speedy change and what that means, and the fact that when you and here's the reference to the UN Women Report. That's the link if you want to find it in the slides. And so this idea of moral panic, and actually I found it quite interesting revisiting the Rubin reading because it's very strong in that reading, and there's been a lot of writing on it. Charmaine Pereira in this book, who's a Nigerian, writes about the control of, she writes about a Nollywood actress who has some images that someone takes from her hard drive when they're fixing her computer. And there's like a huge scandal about these images where she's kind of partially naked, but they were taken in the context, in the privacy of her home, I think, by her boyfriend at the time, and then were made public. And Charmaine Pereira talks about kind of the notions of private and public and women's bodies and the policing of sexuality, but in the context of moral panic. And so there's a lot of theory that says when societies are changing very rapidly, and when there's existential nervousness around that change, women's sexuality becomes the thing that is most heavily policed and most heavily contested. And I think we're definitely in a moment of that right now. And it's interesting to look back. And Rubin's article does that to some extent. He kind of looks back at public policy in the States that has emerged at kind of points of social anxiety. So to some, sexuality may seem an unimportant topic, and this is actually I think this is the introduction, isn't it, of the Thinking Sex? This is the opening paragraph. Sexuality may seem to be an unimportant topic, a frivolous diversion from the more critical problems of poverty, war, disease, racism, famine, or nuclear annihilation. But it's precisely at times like these, when we live with the possibility of unthinkable destruction, that people are likely to become dangerously crazy about sexuality. Disputes over sexual behavior often become vehicles for displacing social anxieties and discharging their attendant emotional intensity. And I actually looked at this and I thought, wow, that's really like useful kind of articulation of this. And I think it's one of the earliest articulations of this kind of moral panic around sexuality, which is very much with us at the moment. And so a lot of Rubin's writing is around the fact that our kind of hysteria around trying to police sexuality is misplaced and the wrong size. It's kind of like totally out of proportion, and in fact very damaging to a lot of people. And we'll talk more about that when we look at her reading in detail. So just some ideas that kind of you need to know about and understand in terms of sexuality politics. So there's writing about pinkwashing and homonationalism. Pinkwashing is where corporations or governments appear to be very queer-friendly in order to eclipse some other forms of repression that they are involved with. And the idea of homonationalism is a kind of elision between the state and homosexual identities. And the famous example of this is Jasbir Puar's writing about Israel, where she says the Israeli state are super friendly towards queers and supportive of pride while kind of killing loads of Palestinians, and that they are pinkwashing their public record by appearing to be kind of super progressive, whereas in fact they are murdering loads of people. So that's the kind of one of the most famous texts that articulates homonationalism. There's a lot of writing about the corporate sponsorship of pride. There's a whole movement around gay shame, which is a kind of counter-normative response to the idea of pride, and that talks about kind of capital and the global politics of sexuality and of pinkwashing in particular. And yeah, this idea that sexuality and support for gender equality, etc., has become a symbol for being more civilized and or more advanced, and therefore is used politically. And you can think about that in relation to Mugabe and Mbeki and the politics of kind of queerness in the 90s in Zimbabwe, and how that articulated. And I'm sure you can all think of lots of other examples, which we'll talk about a bit later. There's a link here to Jasbir Puar, who's a Pakistani-American academic, talking about her book, Terrorist Assemblages, in which she kind of articulates homonationalism, in particular in relation to Israel. And then there's also a link to Sean Fay talking about pinkwashing. The Puar talk's really long, so I won't play it now, but if you're interested in that, please have a look at it. And we might as well have some Sean, if I can actually get this working. Let's see. Okay, I'm going to try. Help. Okay. Let's see if I can do this. I'm just going to copy it over. You can't? Let's see. I don't even know if it's here, actually. An error occurred. Oh dear. I did test this. Come on. Okay, I give up. I tested this last night. Okay, anyway, please have a look at this. Sean Fay is a quite well-known trans commentator in the UK, and before they transitioned, did a lot of very short kind of definitional videos that are really useful. And they've now written a book. I can't remember what it's called. The book is quite poppy and kind of journalistic. It's a bit light, but it's really interesting. And I'm going to go back to this. Okay, some more terms. Cisgender, you all know what cisgender means, right? Anyone not know? So if you're cisgender is a term that kind of came from the transgender movement, and it's to describe people who are born with the gender that they are comfortable being. So, and so women who are born women and stay women and are comfortable being called women, and men the same. Unlike trans folk who tend to transition or at least occupy a non-binary space. And this is a really super helpful. Let me see if I can play this one. Again, I tested this last night and it seemed to work, but Oh.
Incest.
Hello, and welcome to the Transliteracy Project, created by Honest Accomplice Theater. I'm your host, Maybe Bird. Today we're going to kick off the Transliteracy Project video series with Trans 101, so we can lay a foundation before you move on to future episodes. And then if you get confused during the later episodes, you can refer back to this one for a refresher. It's your education. Do what you want. In order to start talking about Trans 101, we need to explore some terms and topics around gender. Gender, sex, sexuality. Three terms that are tossed around so often we begin to think they're the same thing. Which they are so not. So being trans says nothing about your sexuality. You can be trans and a lesbian, you can be trans and straight, the list goes on.
Gender is between your ears.
Sex is between your legs. So when
you
were born, you were assigned a sex, which may or may not match your gender identity. If someone's gender is not the same as the sex that they were assigned at birth, they probably identify as transgender or gender nonconforming. Some people know their identity for as long as they can remember. Some people never think about it, and other folks come to know themselves later in life.
Let's recap. Gender is not defined by a biological body.
Bye, gender. Now that we've cleared that up, let's look for gender. Wait, did you find it? No? Neither did I, because it doesn't really exist. Take a deep breath. Gender is a construct, meaning that it's something society created in order to classify and segregate people. Gender has been used to tell people what roles they should play, how they should live their lives, how they should parent children, etc. It's such a successful construct that most of us aren't even aware of how much it surrounds us, and we readily buy into what it stands for and says. To make gender nice and tidy, a binary was created, meaning you had two options, man or woman. The binary refers to the idea that there are two separate poles, and one is totally masculine and the other is completely feminine. And people are only ever at the extremes of these poles. What's interesting is there's not one person out there who forms masculinity or femininity 100% correctly. Why? Because what is the universal definition of masculinity? Plaid shirt, bulging muscle, money, intelligence. What makes a woman anyway? What makes a man? And who decides who qualifies or not? We don't know. Why don't we know? Because gender is made up. Now here's the big reveal. Yes, the binary impacts trans people, but it also impacts people who aren't trans. The binary does not help anyone. So we're going to talk about gender in more complex and interesting ways. And Cecilia is going to help us out. Gender is often explained as a spectrum. Meaning, there is a man over here, and a woman in the opposite side. But there is space for people in between. And there is not a big piece you fall into if you step out of a man or a woman. Most people view a trans person as somebody who was put on one of the sides of the spectrum when they were born, but actually belonged on the other side. So if they were put at point A, they're now at point B. From a woman to a man, or a man to a woman. And that may be the case. But again, so many people are from point A, but they decide to move to point C, or to point D, or all sort of variation in the middle zone. And some people might not be on the spectrum at all. And that's okay too. And some people may be moving around the spectrum, or under the spectrum, or through the spectrum to entirely new places. Hey, some people don't remain in the same place for their entire lives, or even day to day. And pretty soon, our spectrum is a flowing orb of gender awesomeness. Thanks for your help, Cecilia. Thank you.
Okay. So, I don't know what else they do actually, but it's quite interesting. Of course, that is mostly about gender rather than about sexuality. And one of the things that Rubin says really strongly in their reading is that we need to analytically disaggregate the two, partly because they are often elided by right-wing forces in particular, and more conservative forces. Any ideas? So one of the, and we'll talk about this more in POG, but one of the central splits in the contemporary feminist movement, particularly in the UK, is between kind of radical feminists and the trans movement. Any ideas on why that's the case?
Are we talking about the TERF?
Yeah.
I think it's interesting because the TERF did not come from an academic environment,
Yeah.
right? I mean, it was the one that was criticizing here in the UK, right?
Mm-hmm.
The fact that I think that some trans women were not allowed to enter in a particular space, if I'm not mistaken. And then there's this idea that women who were not born women are not real women.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I guess in Chimamanda, she was very much criticized about that.
Yeah, and also J.K. Rowling. Yeah. Yeah, so I think certainly for a lot of feminists, the threat is contained in the reassertion of the binary. But I think it's a really interesting politics to explore in terms of both gender and sexuality, because of, I think, a lot of problematic politics and blind spots. And in fact, reading the Rubin reading, and particularly the stuff around it, around the kind of acrimonious nature of sexual politics, I think is really instructive, and kind of worrying, I guess, for the feminist movement. I think so. This is a kind of brief thing on backlash, which the kind of backlash actors talk about gender as an ideology, and not so much as something that's being constructed to destroy the family, to create lesbians and gay men, to corrupt children. And often in backlash, there's an elision between gender and sexuality. But actually, we saw that in the previous video to some extent. So I think, just in terms of your analysis, just be really thoughtful as to what you're talking about. And if you are eliding gender and sexuality, then why? And yeah, we'll talk a lot about backlash politics. I'm not going to go into it in too much detail now. But one of the kind of central things is that gender as a concept has been invented to destroy the way that we are and our current way of living and everything, in particular the family. I'm going to take a brief break, and then we're going to look at the readings in more detail. I'm trying to turn this thing off. Bing. Okay, Rubin. Any responses to that reading? Did anyone enjoy it? Did anyone see any of the things that are deeply problematic about it now? Yes?
I mean, it sort of seemed like the paper sort of trying to justify pedophilia.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and that actually, I imagined that would be kind of heavily refuted in her later texts, which is partly why I looked at them, because I have been accused of supporting paedophilia by having this on the reading list in previous years, which obviously was like somewhat challenging. And I did think really long and hard before including it again. But it does, I mean, partly it is a foundational text in the canon. And I also think it's really important for us to be able to read stuff that is challenging and difficult and that we don't agree with, and also stuff that's changed, right? So there was a time, for example, in the 80s, on campus at Sussex, the kind of pederasty movement and the gay movement were very elided. And I've been talking recently because I'm kind of interested in the history of that, as to like why, like almost a kind of pro pedophile, but I don't think it's not. It was kind of gay men who thought that kind of intergenerational relationships were sexual choice in a sense, which is what Rubin talks about. But they were very much a part of the gay movement, and I've been talking to some people who were involved in queer campus politics from that time, and they've said they felt deeply uncomfortable with that. But because everything was kind of illegal and deeply non-normative, there was kind of space because no one could talk about it anyway. So there was this kind of very weird thing at the time in the 80s where, and I think from Rubin's perspective, it's about a kind of idea of sexual liberation where everything goes. And if you read her later stuff, it's much more nuanced around the fact that we need to be able to have conversations about these things. And it comes very much from that kind of a place, like an anti-cancel culture type place, rather than what this reads as, which is kind of very problematic. And there's also a thing about kind of having relationships with trees, I think, which I always have to look up. I can't remember what the word for it is, but I was like, anyway, some students have got very upset about that in the past as well. So, but yeah, I mean, it's very problematic.
This excerpt that spoke about, like, it just created an analogy, like, of masturbating to a shoe. Like, there's this one part which is quite interesting, and then like how when your diets could be different, why is there so much problem with sexuality?
Yeah. And I mean, so that I think that the food analogy is quite a helpful one in a sense, but the kind of implicit potential support of paedophilia, which I don't think is actually that. I think it's read differently, and I think it's much more, but it does, from where we sit now, it does read as super problematically. Yeah. Anything else?
I thought it was really, I was also sort of distracted by the, like, a sort of what we've been talking about in the way that she seems to equate pedophilia with homosexuality and sort of being on the sort of same level.
Yeah.
But also the way that she seemed to be very focused on gay male pedophiles, so talking about like boy love specifically, and not thinking about like heterosexual male pedophiles or like female or any other sort of variants of that. I thought that was sort of a strange, especially given the rest of the paper. I thought it was a strangely sort of narrow focus.
I think that is merely reflective of the social movement politics of that time, where there was like a really strong pederasty movement, and I think the rationale behind that was that a lot of kind of gay men came into sexual awakening through an older kind of intergenerational relationship, there's been some quite interesting kind of counter narratives to that. Zaki Ahmed, who is a South African, has written kind of in defense of pederasty, and so there's a history of gay male kind of argumentation in this field. So I suspect it's purely about that, like what's visible at the time and what's going on. But yeah, it is curious, and totally unhelpful in terms of arguments. Anyone else? Yeah. We'll give you a moment.
Okay. For me, when I read about the way she was talking about the politicizing of the sexuality and how the law, these countries make up the laws which are like they might minimize the space of sexuality, and then she talked that it's not just about the policing it with these laws. It's also about the mental. If you look at policing it in the mentally, because it's just not the law that.
So kind of social exclusion and the significance of that. Yeah. I mean, yes.
There's another idea I want to talk about.
Okay, go ahead.
No, it was really interesting for me also how Rubin mentioned that homosexuality is justifiable in certain instances and under certain controls. And it reminded me of the feminism and ecology when there were also criteria for being powerful and being able to own the land. So, for example, if you are, you have to only be a wealthy man in order to be able to own the land, and even like poor men would come underneath them, and at the end we'll have women. I was just like curious if we would include LGBTQIs or queers in this hierarchy. Where would they be? Would they be before women or after women in this power hierarchy?
Yeah, that's interesting. And maybe it would depend as well. Like I'm thinking in South Africa, for example, there's a association of sangomas or witch doctors with lesbianism, and that if one is a sangoma, then one is allowed to kind of opt out of heteronormative marital structures, and so there's a kind of like almost a sacred space for performing your sexuality in a particular way. And in that sense, yeah, I don't know where you would sit in that hierarchy or how linear it necessarily is either. And it would probably shift. Anyone else? Any thoughts? Yeah.
Also, like while I was reading this, I was like, they banned the pictures of like new pictures of kids.
Yeah.
But like when you see like to study poverty, to show poverty in third world countries, they always use like new pictures of Bangladesh kids. There's like a sort of double standard, like poverty only just like new pictures of kids, but here in the US, it's like so there's like so much.
Yeah. That's really interesting. There's a brilliant MA-GAD dissertation from 2 years ago now by Raisa Philip, who is an ex-MA-GAD student, which we're about to publish as a working paper as part of the Countering Backlash working paper series. And she looks at the way in which child rights are often used against women's rights. So, and a particular case of a Carolyn activist who got her kids to kind of body paint her, and it's a kind of discursive intervention into the way in which women's bodies are policed in Kerala, and then in the courts they basically accused her of child abuse. And so the whole thing is a kind of mobilization of child rights against women's rights. And there's a really interesting report by the IPPG, what are they called? They're a group of philanthropists who do research in the child rights space, and it's a kind of exactly about this kind of top trumping with rights, which we'll talk about next week. But yeah, that's interesting. I do think there are bits of the Rubin text which I'll try and highlight here that are actually really analytically useful, which is why it's still on the reading list. But yeah, feel free to, I mean, there are bits of it that are really not okay. So any other reactions to Rubin?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm
and
going
then
to today, so you know what about me. But I think Rubin's article is very relevant in terms how she analyzes in terms of sex hierarchy and sex negativity, which I think is very relevant even today, right? And then the way that the stigma is produced also to keep this particular group of people in the lower status of society, so they are like stigmatized, and how there is like a barrier that contains these kind of behaviors, and the people that are doing these kind of behaviors, and that there's this fear and this panic that if this barrier just breaks, something really bad will happen, right? I think it's really talks about today.
Yeah, I absolutely. I mean, there is something very contemporary about bits of it. I also think because it's such a broad analysis in a way, it deals with a lot of kind of topics like moral policing, like moral panic, like in a way that, and that connection between kind of class structure and sexuality, I haven't seen as clearly articulated anywhere else yet. Yeah.
I was thinking about consent. Yes. Like sex without consent, it's a rape. But I was thinking, what if the concept is also can be social constructed something.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to young people.
Yeah.
When they have this like people of environment and atmosphere when everything is allowed and the young person, male or female, cannot actually differentiate whether it's her or his concern or whether it's something which is kind of brought from the society.
Yeah, that I mean, and that's what normativity is, right? In a sense, that's like the kind of the fact that it's very different. What's acceptable socially becomes like a really strong thing that pleases individuals as well, and so the notion of consent within that becomes kind of really problematic. And you're talking about power, basically, right? Normative power. So the book that I was telling you about by Jacqueline Rose, which is on violence and violence against women, in that she talks about gender-based violence being about entitlement, and Pumla Nkola, who writes about rape in the South African context, makes similar comments. Is this is if something is kind of endemic and culturally acceptable as a way of being, it's quite hard to distinguish between kind of individual consent and like social endorsement of that activity as well, and which is effectively about kind of gendered and sexualized power and raced power as well. So I mean, if you think about a lot of the like lynchings in the States, for example, which were kind of often young black men who were accused of looking at white women in a particular way, who often didn't do anything at all. And, so there's kind of very weird illusions of certain forms of racialized and sexualized power that operate very powerfully. Yes.
So I found the using the term boy lover, I don't know how I felt about that, but I was just thinking that there's one section where she talks about how it made this difficult for them to find acceptance in society, and they were being chased down by the police. And I was thinking about, I know it's very common where I'm from, but you find a lot of tourists from Europe, America, and the West, white tourists coming to essentially have long-term periods where they just stay in coastal towns and impoverished families, the kids, the young boys who live in the coastal area, it's normalized. It's like that white uncle comes and they pay a small amount for the child to kind of that person will do whatever they want with the child essentially. So I was just thinking about that implication that has as well. And this panic about protecting women and children is just it's fascinating because I think about how that is always the priority. Like I think even about not even women and children, protecting children. I think because it maps on to how I know social media works right now.
Yeah.
Like if you can see if you're given a bunch of, let's say, problematic content like violence against women, violence against children, most companies will be like, let's deal with the kids first and figure that out. But the women, that usually stays, and how this prioritization has not really changed over this is 70 odd years of writing that she's writing about the 50s onwards. So this is 70 years later how we're still I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I've often actually thought about that in terms of kind of male gay tourism, because I've seen it in Brazil, I've seen it in Kenya. I haven't seen it in Asia, but I've definitely heard about it, and the lack of kind of critical discourse around that, and the kind of economics of that, and the power dynamics of that, which is really I and also in terms of social media, I think the Rubin writing, and maybe just because I've recently read, and if anyone wants to take the afterwards and the reflections and the forwards on and skim through them, I have a printed copy here, but I also can email them to you or put them in the announcements. A lot of it is a kind of rallying call against the simplification and the denuancing of these issues, and it kind of reads as almost a contemporary kind of panic about the polarization of issues of sexuality in relation, and she's not writing about it in social media, but she is writing about it in the way that feminism has kind of taken it up in the public space. So I think the Rubin reading is also quite useful in that sense. Anything else? Yes, Hiba.
Yeah, among all of these contribution views of Rubin regarding children's sexuality, the only one thing that I really felt really agreeing with her is the need to recognize the sexuality of children or young people at an early age in order to provide for it and care for it.
Yeah.
I think I was thinking of reading this and thinking that how much this will solve so many problems regarding sexuality over the years, or over for the children as they grow up, whether they are young women.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's a very important.
Yeah, and of course that is something that's actively being shut down in loads of places at the moment, right? Any kind of sex education in schools. So that's really interesting, and I think, I mean, in kind of deference to Rubin, I think what she would probably argue is precisely that we need to be having these discussions. It'd be interesting to know whether the opinion on the other kind of problematic stuff has shifted or not. Yeah.
I was also thinking about the fear around the sexuality. It's from the different groups, whether it's from the religious perspective or the social norms and the person itself. Like, it actually limits the person, who are with the different social construction.
Yeah.
Like, it limits their potentials to live a life with dignity and to live a free life.
Yeah.
And from the religious perspective, they are also in a fear that it might impact the religious perspectives and beliefs, as well as the social construction. So the fear actually surrounded in every aspects of sexuality.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, have you seen Footloose? You know, which is very much about kind of fear of youth and kind of fear of their physical kind of exuberance and their sexuality, and kind of how dancing and kind of being joyful somehow is a dangerous route to kind of everyone being sexual and what that might destroy. And so that it's like an old age kind of thing. And we'll talk about this in relation to aesthetics. So I've been rereading some of Rancier's work for something that I'm writing, and there's this whole kind of, I think it's Plato, not Aristotle, but there's this whole kind of thing about aesthetics and music and how the Phrygian, which is like dun 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 dun, you know, like what's it, Meti, get your freak on, that interval was kind of considered really dangerous because it was somehow sexual in some way. So there's this kind of a lot of weird, which I think Rubin describes quite well, right? This kind of how we invested in sexuality as this thing that everyone's scared of, and it's kind of this very weird Victorian kind of repression. Lou, did you want to say something? No? Okay. Definitely not. Cool. Anyone else? And then I'm just gonna. So what I think I've done is try and pull out I'll try and go forwards. The bits in Rubin that I think are really useful in terms of her analysis, and that I don't think are as well articulated elsewhere. So she argues against much feminist thought that treats sexuality as a derivation of gender, that we really need to separate gender and sexuality analytically. And I do think that's really important, and I think it's politically important now as much as anything else. She says that they're intimately linked, but they play out very differently. And she sets out a sex hierarchy. And basically she argues that this sex hierarchy and all of our kind of hysteria around sexuality is cloaked if we allied it with gender. And in order to kind of precisely analyze sexuality, we need to disaggregate it from gender. And Rubin's work has played a key role in linking Foucault's analysis of sexuality, knowledge, and power to social and political change. Okay, so it's one of the texts that first really does that, and that's why we still study it. Okay, so she says that sex is always political, but there are historical periods in which sexuality is more sharply contested and more overtly politicized. In such periods, and I would argue we're in one of those at the moment, kind of globally, the domain of erotic life is in effect renegotiated. So she says that much of sex law currently on the books, and that's obviously she's writing in the 80s, but I'd say that's still the case, dates from the 19th century morality crusades. And she says that in the 50s in the US, there was a shift from a focus on prostitution and masturbation to the image of the homosexual menace. And I don't know what that... and the sex offender, I think. But yeah, this, again, no tactic for stirring up erotic hysteria has been as reliable as the appeal to protect children from sex offenders. So, again, this kind of moral panic idea. And then this as well is a really, I think, important part of this text. Is that, remember we looked at the WHO definition, which is so broad as to be not particularly helpful. But this idea, and Weeks and Foucault talk about this idea of sexuality as a lens, but also sexuality that is as a concept that is, as an organizing construct that is central to everything. And I think it is. And I don't know if it's just because I've been studying this for too long. But when you start... like when you kind of look at gender as a political lens, when you start looking at sexuality as a lens, you realize how kind of insipid it is and how it does structure so much of the way that we are regulated and regulate society. And it's interesting to think about that, like as you go back into your lives and think, So she talks about sexual politics in terms of phenomena such as populations, neighborhoods, settlement patterns, migrations, urban conflict, epidemiology, and police technology, and says that these are more fruitful categories of thought than the traditional ones of sin, disease, neurosis, pathology, decadence, pollution, or the decline and fall of empires. So why do we associate sexuality with all this stuff? And again, we looked at this and in the last part of the GII lecture, if you want to go back to that, which is about pleasure and danger and whether one can kind of mine anything positive out of gender and sexual-based violence, and the writing around that, trying to look at sexuality through a pleasure lens and what that does to our experience of everyday politics. So the new scholarship on sex has brought a welcome insistence that sexual terms be restricted to their proper historical and social context, and a cautionary skepticism towards sweeping generalizations. And again, her text is really important in that sense. And please apply this to all of your kind of analyses. Generally, do not use sweeping generalizations. So she has these 5 things that are problematic about sexual essentialism that she pulls out. The one is sex negativity, so this association of sex with death and disease and all these kinds of things. Then the fallacy of the misplaced scale, which is this disproportionate weighting of sex acts, and that links to the whole moral hysteria thing. The hierarchical value of sex acts, so procreative sex within marriage is acceptable. Any other forms of sex are kind of morally dubious, some more than others. And the domino theory of sexual peril, this idea that, once something that is unacceptable gets out, then suddenly it will cause our mass destruction. That is kind of interesting. And then the lack of a concept of benign sexual variation. And here's the food analogy, right? It's like we all have different proclivities, we all have different sexual orientations, and that should be acceptable. It doesn't have to be something that we get kind of hysterical about. Again, one might challenge that in relation to some of our other views, but and here, although people can be intolerant, silly, or pushy about what constitutes proper diet, differences in menu rarely provoke the kinds of rage, anxiety, and sheer terror that routinely accompany differences of erotic taste. Sexual acts are burdened with an excess of significance. So she sees sexual variety as something that exists rather than as something that needs to be exterminated. And again, in relation to her potential implicit support of paedophilia, we might want to challenge that. and then these are very famous, these drawings. This is the kind of domino thing, but also these hierarchies between good sex and bad sex, and who sits where on them. Kind of interesting. So and this very central to her work, right? The idea of sexuality is political. Like gender, sexuality is political. It's organized into systems of power which reward and encourage some individuals and activities while punishing and suppressing others. If sex is taken too seriously, sexual persecution is not taken seriously enough. And I think that's really kind of strong central message as well in her work, that we very unhelpfully have historically pursued persecuted sexual deviance in a way that is very damaging, and again, in her terms, like massively outweighs the kind of danger and significance often of those acts and people. Any more on Rubin before I move on to Sylvia's work? Okay, how are we doing for time? Not very well. Okay, so I really like this piece of writing. I think it is very unusual in taking Foucault and applying it in a way that's kind of legible and personal. It's also very honest in a way that's kind of disarming. And this was Sylvia's inaugural lecture when she was becoming a professor at Makerere, and she's a law professor. She's also really interesting. And she's in it grappling with her own kind of judgment, I guess, of Stella Nyanzi, who is a colleague of hers who has been involved in quite a few nudity protests. And I've met Stella. I've met both of them several times, actually. She's a force of nature and quite an amazing character. She's now exiled to Munich, I think, and is involved in there's a writing society that she's kind of working for. But that's quite recent, and before that she was actually standing against Museveni and has been very, very critical of him. But this article is very much about Sylvia Tamale kind of being appalled by her friend's behavior and then kind of trying to deconstruct that and work out which of that is her and what it says about her feminism and which of it is kind of the way that she's normatively supposed to behave, and kind of disaggregating those things. So it's a really interesting, I think, analytical article. And also a beautiful articulation of some very complex theory. So she's trying to work out where her strong, effective kind of response to this thing comes from and what it means legally, particularly in a context like Uganda where there is, and I'd say this probably goes for most contexts, there's a kind of a traditional legal system, there's also a kind of Western legal system, and then there's social norms, and all of those are kind of significant policing constructs in terms of gender. So what does her reflection throw up? And this is direct lifting from her article. With hindsight, I realized that my emotive response to Nyanzi's protest was in keeping with societal attitudes that associate nakedness, especially the nakedness of a grown woman, with shame, perversity, and taboo. Society constructs the female naked body as profane, indecent, shameful, and sexual, never to be displayed in public. Women must therefore cover their bodies. The written law may not prohibit public nakedness, but the living law, and this distinction is really important between law and living law, of most Ugandans. And on this, next week, we'll be looking at rights, and there's a really important text which talks about living rights. So just remember that for when we talk about that, because it comes up here as well. So living law of most Ugandans, including law enforcement agencies, renders it not only illegal, but also immoral and unethical to exhibit our bodies in this manner. And there's a lot of very interesting article about nakedness and nudity and the difference between those two things, including in the context of Femin. I don't know how many of you have come across them, the kind of North African-based social movement, feminists. Try and get the right way. So the power in all the embodied subversive protest demonstrated above is derived from the reversal of positions, where the social superior is subjected to the position of spectator of the naked spectacle put on by the social inferior. It cannot be denied that those spaces of protest have a counter-hegemonic effect on society. It is conferring social death on those violating their freedom. So there's a long discussion in the article about the idea of social death and how a woman can, by being naked, impose social death on those that are oppressing her in other ways. And this idea of a kind of positive power being claimed in the face of a negative power, which is quite, I think, well expressed in the article. And here she makes this really important distinction between nudity, where woman is an object, and nakedness, where woman is an agent or a subject. So this idea that one can subvert with one's nakedness, and that's different from nudity. So it's a choice, and a genital choice to be naked. As powerless people, they mobilize their bodies as a powerful resource, thereby transforming the negative associations of nudity into positive power. Now, I don't know how you feel about this, and how you feel about like the naked female body as a site of power or not, because obviously it's also an extreme site of vulnerability. And there's a lot of interesting discussion and debate about this. And, you know, Tamale's reading is a very positive one, and there are other ones that are really not, and that really question this kind of tactic. So, there's been some great student papers on this over the years as well. Let's try and go the right way. But what Tamale does really well, I think, is kind of apply Foucauldian discourse analysis to this particular event. And she looks at how Stella Nyanzi's act works discursively. So discourse is a system of knowing that entails linguistic practices, subtle cultural code, and interpretive processes. It is through discourse that we see and interpret information, categorize people and events, and justify power relations. Discourse constructs our world of meaning and experience, and it is through the semantic significance of the body that women can mobilize the narrative of vulnerability that is written on their bodies into a political tool by rewriting it as power. The body needs to be understood both as a material and a political entity. So this is Sylvia Tamale kind of explaining how the body works as a symbolic discursive tool and how it is actually a powerful act. And again, one might agree or not with her on this. There's a quite interesting discussion about how women become symbolically powerful but don't have real power, and what that might mean, which I find quite interesting as well. So power is incorporated into the numerous practices, and here this is a really clear articulation of Foucault's notion of power, and embedded in everyday relations. It becomes easier for us to comprehend both its negative and its positive. So power is in the way that we act, and in everything we do, and in our social practices. It's not embedded within individuals, right? The positive potential of power is seen when it is understood to work through people rather than on them. That's really important as well. Feminists added the agency. That's what Tamale says about this. Humiliated bodies can be resignified to humiliate the humiliator. And this is a famous text by Sultana, which you should read if you're interested in this area. When women strip in protest, at best they rewrite and overwrite the dominant sexual script associated with their nude bodies. At worst, they render it illegible. Society must therefore read their naked bodies as powerful icons of defiance and not the objects of sexual display. So the takeaway from Tamale's reading is that the human body is fraught with politics, and it's influenced by complex effects of power derived from institutions such as law, culture, and religion. Female naked protests represent a resistance and a subversion of the dominant scripts engraved on women's bodies, scripts of subordination, passivity, sexuality, subservience, vulnerability, and they show agency, not objectification. What do you think about that? Do you agree?
In certain context, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Because as you said, like sometimes nakedness, female naked protests are feasible and are effective in certain contexts. In other contexts, they may be even harmful to other women in the same context. Because, for example, from my background, like being from the Middle East, naked protests are highly forbidden. And if any woman will be able to do it, it will give like more reasons for people to restrain and restrict other women, because they would be considering this as the whole feminist demands, and this will just add more burdens on local feminists who are working to support other women in their local context. So I guess yes.
I think in Middle East and in my country, not in country, it's not prohibited by someone. This is the women themselves. They do not allow themselves to make such kind of protests.
I mean, I'm not sure. There are some feminists in the Middle East, for example, who did some female naked protests, but they were really not public. But however, like still other people, when would they see them? I mean, most of the feminists, like the Middle Eastern feminists, even if they want, they wouldn't tend to do that because they are afraid of causing more harms on other women. And it's just about the context and the analysis of the sensitivity of the culture that they are working on, and they are rather looking at the wider and picture rather than focusing on some details. And also there is this view that the female naked protest is so westernized. It's a very western way of
and in fact everything that you have mentioned is in the literature on femin as a movement. Exactly that what are you doing to the rest of the movement? Are you compromising people on the ground? But interestingly, so we wrote a blog. Sahel and I wrote a blog about Iran, and we were told that it could only be displayed in certain of the institution websites because it might jeopardize some of the relationships with our partners in the field. And so, I mean, that argument is an interesting one and maybe slightly problematic as well in lots of different contexts.
So in India, there was this protest a long time ago, maybe like 15 years or so, against the Indian army, because in highly militarized zones there is this law where the army cannot be persecuted for anything, and that leads to like a lot of sexual violence. So a woman's body was found where she was raped and shot in her private parts, and a group of women, they call themselves mothers of Pakistan. They were older women, and they sort of staged a protest outside the army base where they stood naked and they held a poster saying Indian Army come rape us. And I find that interesting because I guess female nudity and protests of naked women also are like who's protesting, right? So how are their bodies seen? So I mean the bodies of these women were probably not seen as sexualized as younger women. So like where does that fit into?
Yeah, and in the Indian context, wasn't there also there's a whole kind of naked protest of mothers in different contexts with the military incursion and stuff, and so there's a really interesting kind of vernacular history of older women kind of stripping as well. That's another thing that's in the feminine literature, which is mostly a movement of younger feminists, and there's a whole debate about what it does to have kind of very young bodies on the line and how that might be different if it was a different generation. So I wanted to very quickly, the takeaway from the Correa, Pachetsky and Parker reading that I started with is basically that this idea that sexual justice, sexual rights, sexuality are really imbricated in everything, right? This division between erotic justice and social justice, and between movements for sexual rights and those that aim at economic development and ending poverty and war, derives from an epistemological error that extracts intimate bodily experience from its social matrix. And such a division makes no sense in the context of real people's lives. So they really argue that, this idea of which you talked about quite a lot of kind of social hierarchies, of which sexuality is one, and that they're all kind of holding each other up in a way, and that we need to deconstruct them if we're going to have social justice, and that these are not marginal issues. These are the ways in which we have built our society as an unjust one, and therefore kind of we need to unlearn and deconstruct that, including very centrally how we deal with sexuality. And then I wanted to end on, and I hope this works, something that is kind of very everyday and mundane, but is a sexuality issue, right? Breastfeeding in public, and that is a kind of universal thing to try and make you think about sexuality as not as extraordinary, but as everyday, and as really like something that is in every society policed quite heavily in some ways, and impacts on people's behavior. I don't know how many of you have had to breastfeed and been in a public place, but these kinds of lots of can't do this. Okay, let me just do this. This is Holly McNish, who's part of a group of spoken word artists based in South London, and is quite brilliant. Let's see if this works. It's not working. Again, it was working yesterday. What's going on? Yeah, maybe. Okay, let's try another browser. Is there another browser? Yes, there is. No. Let me just try find it, otherwise I can very quickly read it, but she's better at it than I would be.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
I mean, in Kyrgyzstan, it's interesting, in very conservative and traditional society where all other genders issues, let's say, are really prohibited, and it's really hard to promote women's empowerment. But when it comes to something that's related to motherhood and breastfeeding, it's completely normal.
Right.
I didn't have any kind of problems while I was breastfeeding in the cafe or in the parks. It's really interesting how it can be controversial in one country. Yeah.
That is really interesting.
When I see the stories from US, for example, I'm really kind of shocked why it's possible.
Oh yeah, I saw recently actually that in the States, in some of the states of the States, they had introduced like little cubicles. Oh, sorry.
Like if you go to the mall, there will be like a little hut, and it's like a breastfeeding hut, and you have to go and sit in this little hut.
Yeah. That's what I wanted. Okay, let's see if you can hear this. It sounds pretty.
There's some funny pictures of the breastfeeding hut, and like a Victoria's Secret right next to it. He's got like these giant photos of boobs.
It's ridiculous.
Sitting in the hut to do this.
Okay, let's see if this works.
I thought it was okay. I could understand the reasons. They said there might be a man or a nervous child seeing this small piece of flesh that they weren't quite expecting. So I whispered and tiptoed with nervous discretion. But after 6 months of her life sat sitting on lids, sipping on milk, nostrils sniffing on piss, trying not to bang her head on toilet roll dispensers, I wonder whether these public loo feeds offend her. Because I'm getting tired of discretion and being polite. As my baby's first sips are drowned-drenched in shite, I spend the first feeding months of her beautiful life feeling nervous and awkward and wanting everything right. surrounded by family till I stepped out the house. It took me 8 weeks to get the confidence to go into town. Now the comments around me cut like a knife as I rush into toilet cubicles, feeling nothing like nice. Because I'm giving her milk that's not in a bottle. Wishing the cocaine generation white powder would topple. I see pyramids, sales pictures across Ivory globe and female breasts banned. Unless they're out just for show. And the more I go out, the more I can't stand it. I walk into town till I'm surrounded by bandits, because in this country of billboards covered in tits, and family news agent magazines full of it. W.H. Smith top shelves out for men, why don't you complain about them then? In this country of billboards covered in tits, and family news agent magazines full of it. W.H. Smith top shelves out for men, I'm getting embarrassed in case a small flash of flesh might offend. And I'm not trying to parade it. I don't want to make a show. But when I'm told I'd be better just staying at home, and when another friend I know was thrown off a bus, and another mother told to get out of a pub, even my grandma said maybe I was sexing it up. And I'm sure the milk makers love all this fuss, all the cussing and worry and looks of disgust as another mother turns from nipples to powder, ashamed or embarrassed by the comments around her, and as I hold her head up and pull my cardi across, and she sits on that liquor made by everyone's God, I think for God's sake Jesus drank it. So did Siddhartha, Muhammad and Moses and both of their fathers, Ganesh and Shiva and Brigid and Buddha, and I'm sure they weren't doing it sniffing on piss as their mother sat embarrassed on cold toilet in a country of billboards covered in tits, in a country of low-cut tops, cleavage and skin, in a country of clothes bags and recycling bins, and as I desperately tried to take all of this in, I hold her head up. I can't get my head round the anger towards us and not to the sound of lorries offloading formula milk into countries where water runs dripping in filth. In towns where breasts are oases of life, now dried up in 2-for-1 offers, enticed by labels and logos and gold standard rights, claiming breast milk is healthier, powdered and white, packaged and branded and sold at a price so that nothing is free in this money-fueled life, which is fine if you need it, or prefer to use bottles, where water is clean and bacteria boiled. But in towns where they drown in pollution and sewage, bottled kids die, and they know that they do it. In towns where pennies are savoured like sweets, we're now paying for one thing that's always been free. In towns empty of hospital beds, babies die, diarrhea fueled that breast milk would end, so no more will I sit on these cold toilet lids. No matter how embarrassed I feel as she sips. Because in this country of billboards covered in tits, I think we should try to get used to this.
Okay, thanks everyone. Proof that spoken word is more effective than academic articles for now.
I also find that, like, for example, on Facebook, like terms, like they will leave a very revealing picture of a woman, but they will take off a picture of a woman breastfeeding because it's against the community guidelines. So,
that's interesting. Yeah. I wonder if that's a kind of child protection issue. I mean, it's perverse, isn't it? Yeah. Anyway, so I mean, in case it's not obvious, I wanted to end on that. I mean, partly because it's very complex and powerful in terms of, capitalism and the other issues it introduces, but also just because it is, is an everyday thing. This kind of the way that sexuality is policed and structured, and I just wanted to think about that a bit. Cool. Thanks, everyone. See you. If you are interested, at lunchtime, we are launching this book, and there'll be a really interesting debate. Also, lawyers who are academics, and Priya, who's amazing generally. So please come. It's in the convening space.
thank you, Tessa.
Thank you. I'm going to turn this thing off.